On this week's episode of 90 Degrees, when ESPN knew it was time to pivot to sports betting and is the future of media, a full-scale marriage with sports books, that and more on today's episode of 90 Degrees. Welcome to the 90 Degrees podcast, where we take an inside look into the sports betting industry. I'm your host, G-Stack George, and today's guest has done it all in the sports landscape. I've got David Bearman, Chief Content Officer for the Pro Football Network. David, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be on.
I literally said you did it all because you started off in media relations for the Florida Marlins and Albuquerque Isotopes. First of all, how do you get into that? Like, did you fall into it? Is that something you wanted to do? And what does that entail?
Sure. Like most kids in high school, having absolutely no idea what you want to do with your life, you always say, hey, I'm pre-law. I'm going to go University of Florida and get a law degree, because that's what everybody says they're going to do when they're 15 years old. I was in Fort Lauderdale, Miami area, big fan of all the teams down there, and season ticket holder and obsessive listener to sports radio. And long story short, my dad is a teacher, and he was a fellow colleague whose husband was Dave Lamont, who was pre and post game for the Miami Heat. And I had met him at a picnic for my dad and his wife's the teachers union. And I was honored to meet him. I follow all the sports, the sports media scene, and had asked me if I was interested in going to a game like with the media and to watch it. And I did, and I fell in love right off the bat, like just being able to be courtside and being on the truck and all that. And then you fast forward a couple of months, I'm a senior in high school, and WQAM radio, which is was it the host of all the teams at the time, the official on-air radio host of all the teams. Hank Goldberg was the afternoon drive host, and Hank was complaining that he had no help in the rat-infested, bug-infested studios, that he would love somebody to come in here and be an intern and help out and give scores and updates and stuff like that. So I volunteered. The radio station was 2 miles from my high school. So I walked in there and said, I'll be an intern. And I was an intern throughout the spring and throughout the winter and spring, if you call it winter in Florida. And then I got accepted to the University of Florida, but I wasn't starting until the fall admission. And so I went to the programming director and said, hey, I'm here all summer. I'll do whatever, cut tape, cover teams, whatever you need me to do. And he said, well, the Marlins play-by-play guys would really need an intern in the booth. And that could be getting them scores off the ticker, getting them popcorn, whatever it takes as an intern. So I said, sure, I'll do it. And that was 1996. That summer, I was with the team the whole year until I went to school. And then while I was now a broadcast student, changed from pre-law to broadcasting and got into it at the radio station at the University of Florida, covering their athletic events. I went back and said, can I do it again the next summer? And they took me back, and that was the year they won the World Series. And it can continue the path of, I'm now in the media industry, did some TV, and I always joke that I could have written the book about being a professional intern, because I did about 5 of them in the Florida sports media industry between TV and radio stations. But also got to know the Marlins organization and their PR staff and the wonderful people who worked that 96, 97, and 98 seasons pre-World Series, during the World Series, and then the meltdown of the next year that was a 54 and 108 slog. I worked all 3 of those seasons. Put me on the radar, helped me get a job out of college at the baseball winter meetings with their single A affiliate in Kane County, eventually Marlins PR, then Albuquerque Isotopes were the Marlins AAA team, and we speak here for hours about how that all went down, but it was all related to the Florida Marlins, who I started out as an intern with through the WQAM radio station back in 1996, and that's what started it all. And then obviously working in sports information at school, working in the sports media industry at various stops in North Carolina, Chicago, Albuquerque. Now I'm in Bristol, Connecticut, having worked for ESPN for 18 years prior to my move over. But that's where it all started, down in Cooper City, Florida, working for various sports media entities down there, from WQAM to TV stations, etc.
Well, you're a radio guy, so you've already got my heart, because that's my beginning in media. Okay, your media relations, and what exactly does that job entail? Because are you the guy that when I reach out and say, "Hey, David, this stud pitcher Levon Hernandez or Gary Sheffield, I want to get him on an interview," and you say, "Well, I can't get you Levon, but I can get you our backup third baseman." Or is that Are you the guy who would do that?
Yeah, I mean, I did that and a lot more while working, which is how I got into PR. I'm working with the WQAM radio as their intern with the Marlins in their radio station press box, working with the Marlins broadcasters. When the Marlins got good and all of a sudden they were contending in 1997, it was like a two-team race between them and the Braves. So the Braves and the Marlins had this mini rivalry in 96 in 97. You're talking about the great Braves teams of Greg Maddux and Chipper Jones and Tom Glavine. And whenever they were in town, the show would come from the stadium. They would do the show from the stadium, and I was the intern, so I'd be the runner who would go get the players. And this is before text messaging and emailing PR directors. So I literally would go into the Braves clubhouse and talk to the PR director and say I need to grab a player, and yeah, let's go ask Greg Maddux if he can join the Hank Goldberg show, and then I would take him and we'd go to again, not exactly cell phones in 1997, so clubhouse phone and pick it up and call into the radio station or find a phone somewhere in the bowels of the stadium and get the hookup to WQAM. So that's where it started. And then if you fast forward years later, working in media relations, yes, you're now the media relations director and single A ball and triple A ball and working for the Marlins. And yeah, I would help the PR staff. And specifically when I was in Albuquerque, because Albuquerque, it was my show. I was the director of media relations. I had people interning for me for the first time. I was getting paid to do this. And yes, I was in charge of the media guide, the programs, all the media information, working with the newspapers and radio stations. Blogs were in its infancy. Today it's social media craze and Twitter and everything and Instagram. But yeah, back then it was set the players up with their interviews, get feature stories done. Heck, I would go to different TV stations in Albuquerque and go on air and say, hey, this Friday we're giving away this beach ball, so come get it. And all of a sudden the local station would put the list of isotope promotions and media relations. You're promoting your team. You're talking to the newspapers. You're talking to social media. Your TV stations would come out and interview players. And yeah, that's basically what media relations was. It's different at different levels. Single A ball, there's not a lot of player features. When I did single A ball, it was in a suburb of Chicago. And not sure if you know, but Chicago has the Cubs and White Sox. So single A ball is not exactly at the top of the media's list. It is for the fans who want to be able to afford to go to a game. So that's a little bit harder, but Albuquerque was a college town that happened to have a minor league baseball team, so it became a little bit more focused on them. Plus, it was a new team in a new stadium, and oh, by the way, their parent company went on to win the World Series with some of their players. So that's what I did pretty much 96 to '05 before going to ESPN was broadcasting and media relations. Same thing at University of Florida SID department. You're setting up, you're giving out the game notes, doing storylines, and you're setting up the interviews with the players as well.
How does the ESPN thing happen? Is it through your connections, through media relations, dealing with them? Is it you apply for a job posting, or is it they headhunt you and they want to steal you over to ESPN?
Combination of all three. The actual story was ESPN was doing one of their Sports Century features on John Wetland, who is the former Yankees reliever, mid '90s, who went on to become a pitching coach in major and minor leagues. And at that current time in 2004, he was actually it was 2003 was the first time I got contact with them. They wanted to do a feature on him, and he was the pitching coach for the Oklahoma City Redhawks, who at the time was the AAA affiliate of the Texas Rangers. And not to throw anybody under the bus, but the PR person at the time was non-responsive, did not return any of ESPN's emails. And then they came to Albuquerque for a matchup. We were division rivals, and so ESPN reached out to me and said, "Hey, we can't get through to Oklahoma City, so can you set this up? We'll come to Albuquerque and do it." And I said, "Yeah, it's my job." And I went over and set it up with John Wetland, and they did the whole feature on him right there in Albuquerque. And afterwards, the field producer said, "Hey, here's my card." Still did business cards back then. If you ever need anything, let me know. And I said, "Well, I got something for you," and I handed him my resume. And I said, "Hey, just if you're ever in Bristol, here it is." My resume was passed along to the ESPN Stats Information Department, which at the time was just production research, and it was a group of people who sit there and do the stats and research behind all of their live programming, anything from what started as Baseball Tonight to college football shows, including College Football Game Day with the Bear Chris Felica, and Sports Center, and any other show on the network that eventually you work your way up and you become the golf researcher, and now I'm doing Golf remotes, you can sort of see the flags in the background, traveling to do Masters US, British Opens. But every single show, and it's still to this day, if you watch ESPN, every show has a researcher with it. Even Monday Night Football will have a researcher there behind the scenes, giving the commentators either in the from the truck into the booth with like Joe and Troy, or post and pregame show, or back in Bristol with if the show's back there. Scott Van Pelt's show has a researcher, worked on that a little bit. That was the genesis of how I got to ESPN, from media relations and stats into their stats department, and then worked your way up through the funnel there over 18 years.
Hey, I want to talk to you about Pinnacle. Pinnacle is the world's sharpest sports book and available to bettors in Ontario. Find out what professionals have known for the last 25 years. Everyday competitive odds, your trusted sports book. Bet smart, bet Pinnacle. Must be 19 plus in Ontario. Please play responsibly. Not available in the US. Now back to the show. Yeah, I remember hearing, so Chris Collinsworth does the Sunday night football game, and obviously Chris Collinsworth also owns Pro Football Focus, so he would get always a couple of employees to come with him
Yep.
to feed him some unique stuff, and that's kind of my thought process and memory of that. So you obviously you spent a long time at ESPN in different roles. The one of them I want to talk to you specifically about is you spend some time in the ESPN stats and info department, and they got this great Twitter account, like 2 million followers, and they're always tweeting some crazy stuff about like historical stuff of like this is the first time it's happened since 1895. Now I don't understand how you can have a database of that wide, and I'm assuming there's like a million filters to get that information. Who's coming up with ideas of like let's dig and find a unique stat or a situation? Is there a whole team? Like how big is the roster?
When I joined, I was number 25 at the time. They'd expanded to 25. When I left 6 months ago, the stats information department had over 150 people. In terms of pure researchers on the content team, on the shows, doing what you mentioned about Collinsworth, whether it's Monday Night Football with Joe and Troy, whether it's College Game Day where you saw Chris the Bear Felica, that roster is probably in the 45 to 50 range. And then there's a whole team that handles the bottom line scroll that you see on your TV that has stats, scores, information, and news. And then there's a whole team of probably 20 full timers and another 100 and something part timers for the busy college weekends, that do the live tracking of the scores and the highlight. They basically, you're live tracking a basketball game, so you can go back and find out how many times LeBron James was in ISO, or how many times he was double teamed or pick and rolls, because that's not in the box score. The box score is the box score, but everything beyond that comes from video tracking, which they have an entire team who does that. They have an entire team that loads rosters, entire team that does scrubbing of box scores. The stats info team is 150 deep. And in terms of what they use with you're talking about the databases. When I first started, we had a relationship with the various stat agencies, most notably the Elias Sports Bureau, which you'll hear people drop all the time. Tim Kirchin, big fan of the Elias Sports Bureau and using their content. And when I worked on Baseball Tonight, I had a Elias Sports Bureau researcher sitting next to me at all times, because baseball is the sport of all sports when it comes to statistics. Uses statistics on everything, whether it's regular stats, advanced stats, etc. So I would have a researcher with me and researching the show, and we were getting Carl Ravage and John Kruk and Buster Olney, all of their information. More recently, they've moved to creating their own. Once you're starting to bring all the stats in through the various feeds, and we have direct feeds to all the major sporting events and leagues, you start creating your own databases. I created a BCS database back in the day that had all the rankings that came out for the 6 weeks leading up to the BCS. But there's a True Media database for baseball and football, and some of it's powered by our content, and some of it's powered by Elias's content, and there's other at the time Stats Inc. etc. But it's a collaborative effort in terms of think tank and ideas. Every person in that department has the ability to create stories, and the motto being deliver the most insightful, accurate, and fast information on the planet. And there's no better group of people that I've worked with in my entire life than the stats and information department, that I personally spent 11 years in of my 14 years of my 18-year career at ESPN, from an entry level researcher all the way up to associate director of content. Just every day there's meetings upon meetings about storylines, and we have preview packets, in-game packets, post-game packets. Every show the company has a show meeting where they talk with the talent, producers, researchers, walk through all of the different content we're going to talk about, and then you have the statistical angle behind it.
All right. Finally, in April 2019, after 14 years at ESPN, you become the deputy editor of sports betting. Were you sports betting before, like growing up throughout your time at ESPN? When does that position, first of all, become a thing? Like, when does ESPN understand sports betting has got to be a thing that we need to put some resources in?
Yeah, it was a slow process that I stayed on. Was one of the survivors of it that kept pushing it from the beginning. I go back to you asked the question how long. I've always had an affinity for sports betting. Can't go
Where
into
did it
how much
start?
so because it was illegal before
No, but
2018.
where did it start for you? Like, kid? Are you a teen? What age do you get, like, learn that this is a world? And do you remember what you were betting when you first started?
Combination of barbershop parlays, being at the barbershop and my dad's barber having running a little parlay card system
Yeah,
where
yeah,
my dad, not to throw him under the bus, was doing it, $10 weekly. And one day I was in the chair, and my dad would still say to this day that nobody knows more about sports than his son. And he gave me the card and said, pick three. So I picked three, and it won.
and you're
Okay.
hooked.
Hooked.
That's how it goes.
I always remember my dad taking me once to Highlight in Dania Beach, which was can be fun even outside of the gambling. It's still the world's fastest sport, even though it's died off.
Yeah,
But a big fan of Highlight, even beyond the betting, the actual sport itself. And my dad's like, "Well, I'm going to get him out of this parlay nonsense because I'm going to show him how to lose because betting is not a long term winning thing." And we hit four quinellas that night of the 8 games. So the process of showing me how to lose didn't work. I got into playing cards at an early age. Won't tell you how early, but I played a lot of poker when I was a kid. So I was surrounded by the action of wanting to do it. I lived 15 minutes from what is now Hard Rock Casino in Fort Lauderdale. Back then, they just had a cigarette infested poker room, 7 card stud and hold'em.
yeah,
But over time, there are ways to bet sports prior to 2018, and
yes,
not
of
going to sit
course.
here and deny that I wasn't part of that.
Yeah,
Um, and would always want to push the content at ESPN. And in 2014, Fox Sports One was launching. Fox was launching Fox Sports One, which at the time ESPN considered a potential competitor. Laugh at it now, and nobody can find FS1 on their dial.
yeah,
But at the time, we had think tank meetings about how we were going to combat the fact that Fox was launching a station that potentially could take away ESPN viewers. And I raised my hand and I said, sports betting. I'm like, what do you mean? I go, Fox is going to lean into sports betting because they are more, they take bigger chances than other media agencies do.
yeah. They do. They've always had a wide risk of
Right.
content.
Right. I mean, that goes back to the Married with Children stage. Who doesn't remember watching Married with Children, which was, if you think about it, like now we laugh, but that type of television didn't exist in the 90s. That's not something that was a risk. Now every show is like that. But same frame mind that they're going to do sports betting. So let's do something about it. And it was like, yeah, great idea, but Disney and ESPN aren't going to do that right now. But if you want to keep it as a hobby, as a niche area, sure, push it. And I did. I would push content to Sports Center, and every once in a while they would show the odds to win the next Super Bowl after the Super Bowl, or they would show the odds to win the next NBA Finals. So every once in a while that would show up, very small. But everybody, it was fantasy, fantasy, fantasy. But during the process, Chad Millman, who now runs the Action Network, was the editor in chief of ESPN.com. Met with him as two of the quote unquote OGs of sports betting at ESPN, and said we can do more. And then we got into a purchase agreement with the Gold Sheet out in Las Vegas to purchase their databases. So they sent us their databases for an unnamed price. That consisted of some files digitally, and some files looked like I had found the Dead Sea Scrolls, where I had ledgers back to the 50s from old school Vegas. Exactly what you would think if you were writing a movie about betting in the 50s and 60s in Vegas. I now had that data in ledgers. Um, and we spent the next 2 or 3 years putting that into our databases. So we had more and more content. Right now, ESPN has an all games NFL database that goes back to the year of the first Super Bowl, where there's every line, total, money line, and you add regular stats to it like quarterback and head coach and this and that for every single game since 1966. And then you do that for NBA all the way back to Jordan's first year, and you do it for college football all the way back to the merger of FBS and FCS, and on and on and on. And we started building that because lo and behold, in 2018, PASPA overturned the federal ban on sports betting, and it was poof. All of a sudden, sports betting is legal, and it's like, all right, now the corner offices in Bristol are, all right, what can we do here? And I'm like, hey, remember me, the guy from the last couple of years? I asked to do a show and built databases and keep pushing content. Oh yeah. Let's do that. Um, they okayed a pilot for a betting show based on meetings that we had where we had pitched it. Um, I believe it was Thanksgiving of 2018, so probably like 4 or 5 months after PASPA was overturned. And I figured we'd put the pilot to tape. We'd find out. Maybe they would do it, maybe they wouldn't. Went all the way up to Disney, the top, Bob Iger. And I figured, hey, if I'm lucky, we would have a green light for the fall of 2019. Found out right after the holidays, January, that the show was greenlit for March Madness. Okay, well, you now have 10 weeks to put a show together. So I pretty much got taken off all my other duties that I was doing to work with our production units to put together a brand new show, which includes, it's now Daily Wager, by the way. If you watch Daily Wager, which is on Monday through Friday, it's actually now on Saturday and Sundays. It's Monday through Friday and Sunday when I was there. I believe they're off Tuesday and Wednesday now. But that was how Daily Wager started. And we launched in March of 2019, just before, or was that March of 2020? Yeah, March of 2019. Yeah, because we had it on for one full year before we were going to move it to Vegas, and then COVID hit, and that's a whole nother story. Um,
Hey, the easiest way to improve as a sports bettor is use multiple sports books and always get the best odds. We recommend using an odds comparison tool like BetStamp. BetStamp compares odds across every sports book for games, futures, and player props. Save time and money by checking BetStamp before you bet. Download the app today. If you're looking to sign up for a new sportsbook account, please check out the offers available at betstamp.app/circles off or hit the link in the description. If you sign up through this page, it helps support the show. Now back to the episode, which I want to get into.
okay.
We don't have ESPN in Canada, so like I wasn't exposed to the world of Daily Wager and how fast American traditional media started to get around it. My question is: are they converting other employees? Are they asking around? Do you know anything about betting? Do you like betting? Or outside of acquiring the gold sheet, are they looking to hire people within the sports
Yeah,
betting field?
there was definitely a change in mindset in May of 2018 when PASPA overturned it. By November we had pitched a show, and by January it was greenlit for March of 2019. We had a website, ESPN Chalk, which is now ESPN Sports Betting, that was producing betting news and content, but it was kind of lumped in with everything else. Like it was lumped in with poker and esports, and MMA and UFC and all that. And then as we were launching the show in March of 2019, the guy who was running ESPN.com, who replaced Chad Millman, wanted to expand ESPN Chalk and make it an actual vertical on its own in its own area, and promoted me to out of the stats department to run ESPN Chalk. And that's what I spent the next 4 years doing before coming to Pro Football Network, because I was the deputy editor of sports betting. But it started with the databases. It started with the pitching of the show. We were having monthly meetings that, when talked about content, all of a sudden sports betting now had a part of it. So you would go to a planning meeting for Sports Center and other shows, and normally be going right down the list of sports. And all of a sudden, sports betting, hey, anybody from sports betting? And we started, I mean, it was a 5-man department at that point. Like it wasn't an actual department, it was just borrowing resources. But we would attend those meetings and we would say, hey, here's the content that we think would work. And now people were open to it.
Yeah.
All right. So I shouldn't be afraid to
It's not
throw
that
the odds
hidden
on
thing.
sports
It's
center.
not that thing you hide in the closet. It's like
Right,
poker. Poker was the bad reputation,
right.
and then it became, "Oh, it's cool to play poker," and sports betting kinda has taken the same evolution.
Yeah, it was like you know what it was. It was tongue in cheek. Someone would do a highlight and say that last touchdown means something for somebody, and hey, the people in the desert didn't like
Yeah. Al
no lo-
Michaels
yeah,
was the king of that.
no longer needed to hide it.
Yeah.
So you know what ESPN platforms showed in February of 2018 and what they were showing in the fall of 2018 were drastically different. Um, Obviously, you start getting something like Bad Beats on Scott Van Pelt show, which I was part of a group of people who thought of doing an editorial column on Bad Beats, and then it turned into a TV segment, which is now well known throughout the industry. Um, College Game Day, Lee Corso, when he used to make his picks, he'd be like, "I expect Florida State to win by 6 and an extra point." Okay, you expect them to cover the 7. I get it. Now you can say it. Now you can show it. And this is all 2018, 19, 2020, launching a show officially, having a 5-day a week sports betting show that has the L screen compression, that has all of the information on it that I was helping design, and expanding Chalk into its own vertical and having it in the app. It wasn't in the app before because the app has a certain age restriction. And what do you get around that? And then you change all that, and all of a sudden, sports betting's in the app. And then obviously going further into April, May of 2019, where we make a deal with Caesars to be the official odds provider of ESPN. Now you're really monetizing it. You have link out deals, and you can then click and go to DraftKings from the ESPN.com. And all those things came. And obviously, you've seen the latest news of them working a deal up with Penn Gaming to be ESPN Bet, which will launch sometime in the next couple of months.
And
Um,
acquiring, Pat McAfee, who was being
right,
paid handsomely by FanDuel at the time, so, like,
correct,
ESPN is like, now there's no
right.
hesitation. They've jumped right into the deep end with this stuff.
Yeah, and that was the genesis of it. That was the background of it. And now, yeah, now it's on every platform. You're not afraid to do it. There's still limitations to what you can do. Each league still has its rules, and ESPN's not taking bets, but they're involved with the sports books and they're promoting sports betting content. And there's commercials on television on ESPN that you never saw before, and all that stuff. It all started in May of 2018.
David, how far do you think it goes? Because right now we're being inundated with sports betting content. There's some traditionalists who are pushing back and saying, I don't care about this stuff. And right now the money's flowing, right? The books are paying good money to these media companies, and everybody's doing it. Are we gonna hit a point where it goes too far and we've got to scale back again? Or do you just see right now upward trajectory without any hesitation?
I think there'll be some limitations on the commercials. I think the commercials have gone to the point where it's inundated to the fan that doesn't have any interest in it. And there's some truth to that. You don't necessarily need 47 sports betting commercials during a game. So there are limitations, but I don't think there'll be any limitations on content. At the end of the day, and especially from my point of view, my job for 18 years at the company, no matter what my role was, from entry level researcher to associate manager of the bottom line scroll to deputy editor of sports betting, my role was always had one thing in common. It was to produce the most compelling content for the network. That's what it was. What is the most compelling content, whether it's statistics related or not, storyline driven? What is the most compelling storyline? And my pitch was always, that's great that you can say Tom Brady is 7-1 all time at Miami. But what if I told you he was 2-6 against the spread? That's also a good note. Like, Tom Brady's teams have won, but they don't cover. So they're close games. And you start working that stuff in, and, the end result is you have more tools at your disposal to sell compelling storyline content, which is the mission of ESPN's main mission is to serve the fan. So
I think my question is, do you does all content or the mainstream live content end up becoming all encompassing fantasy, sports betting, and traditional, as in who's going to win at fandom? Or do you think they have to create a second branch and fully embrace the sports betting and fantasy and give people a choice of what they want to watch? Do you think it's going to be over time? People's interests change, and eventually everybody's going to evolve into liking fantasy and sports betting. Also, as the demographic, the older demographic gets older and the younger guys who grew up on this stuff When we're in our 40s and 50s, it's almost it's expected. Do you see a merging of that idea, or do you think they have to keep two separate broadcasts?
I think a little bit of both. I think on the written part and the digital part, you'll see it all combined. You know, you can write a whole column about a game and then mix in some betting content. But in terms of broadcasts, I think it'll be separate. Like for years, we did a separate betcast at ESPN during Monday Night Football and wild card games. Where we had a separate broadcast on ESPN Plus or ESPN News because you didn't want to just shove it down a normal viewer's throat. I don't think you'll ever see the day where a national broadcast is all sports betting. Like, you know, Joe and Troy can drop a betting line or a nugget, but they're never going to have like a full fledged betting thing in a Monday Night Football broadcast. But your halftime show might be sponsored by DraftKings, and
Yeah,
Scott Van Pelt on Monday Night Football Countdown might do a segment on betting. But you would use like Daily Wager or stuff like that as a pregame show leading in on a different channel. For instance, we did 2021. We did week one Monday Night Football. There was the main broadcast with, I believe at the time it was Steve Levy and company, and was it Levy, um, Ovlasky, and Louis Riddick did the ESPN ABC broadcast. ESPN2 had this brand new thing called the Manning Cast that nobody knew if it was going to take off.
yeah,
It has. And ESPN Plus had the Betcast. So you had your normal traditional broadcast. You had your second screen, let's watch the Manning brothers talk about the game from their perspective. And then you had the betting angle. I think that's the model going forward.
mm,
We're developing things at Pro Football Network where as soon as I'm off the phone with you, I'm going to go tape a betting podcast for Thursday Night Football. I'm going to tape with our betting director. We're going to give our picks for betting night football for Thursday Night Football. But if you don't want to listen to that, you can go listen to our Bengals podcast or our Dolphins podcast or our Cowboys podcast. You don't have to listen to them.
yeah.
Maybe next week or the week after, as we get closer to the mid-season of the NFL, I might be on the Dolphins podcast giving my thoughts on where the Dolphins stand halfway through the season. But it's not going to be the full thing.
Yeah.
So you can integrate it, but you also have to make sure that there is its own entity in case you want it. Like we currently have a YouTube channel for fantasy and a YouTube channel for NFL content. We don't have one for betting yet. That's coming, but
Yeah.
it's also the first year we're doing real full-fledged betting content at Pro Football Network.
I am going to ask you about your transition to Pro Football Network. One last note: I can bet my last dollar that right now media companies are focus grouping the hell out of how much is too much sports betting content and how much is enough, because they want to know. This is what media companies do. They focus group these things. They pay big money to learn about how far they can push the parameters. You leave ESPN to go to Pro Football Network. You're in charge of all content. Is am I right by that? And you guys aren't the only ones who are not just branching out of football and doing fantasy and betting and the draft. Pro Football Focus took the same angle, and I remember the transition 4 years ago, where it's like first it was fantasy, and everybody wants to know how this affects their fantasy team, and then now there's a betting aspect, and it almost feels like all media companies have to do this now. It's the three-headed monster that you have to serve, because there's the guy who all he cares about is if his Bills win this week. Then there's the guy who all he cares about is that Justin Jefferson gets a touchdown for his fantasy team. And then there's the guy who all he cares about is if the Vikings are going to cover the spread this week. Right? There's three different customers. Oftentimes there's a lot of overlap, but you gotta provide everything for them. Um, what is your role right now at Pro Football Network? What are you in charge of everything?
Sure. I'm in charge of all the content. We have four pillars. We have NFL news and analysis, which includes national coverage as well as specific beat coverage on the Cowboys, Dolphins, and Bengals. We have reporters in all three cities.
Mhm.
We have a fantasy lane, which is all things fantasy that has been there since the beginning of the company. We have a scouting and college recruiting angle, which if you ever play with our mock draft simulator, that's part of what built the site. Tool that everybody uses to go do mock drafts in does really well for us, obviously in March and April, and then the betting wing, which we've had betting content before on Pro Football Network, but we are formally have a betting vertical now where I hired a betting director, Brian Lewis from Caesar Sportsbook in July to head up our betting. We have part timers and contractors putting together stuff, and we have increased our betting content tenfold over last year, and month over month from September, we're up 3 times our page views. I oversee all of that, so I have directors overseeing every single vertical, and then they all report up through me. And we're trying to expand even more. So you're right about the three, 4 headed monster. Like it's all about driving revenue. And if you just sit on NFL, you're going to lose out on fantasy. If you just sit on fantasy, you're going to lose out on betting. And you go to our website, you can read our betting articles, but you can also go and click on our link to DraftKings, and it'll take you there, and you can deposit, convert, first time depositor, and bet through DraftKings, and the company gets credit for that. And
Yeah, the
there's a rev share
affiliate
when it comes to that.
affiliate
And
link. Yeah,
yeah, we have affiliate stuff, and at some point we're hopeful that we're going to have an odds provider deal like ESPN did. So um I called it a hard reset when it came to our betting content, because really, if you go back and look last year, it was sort of like, yeah, our fantasy writer will also write some betting stuff, and our dolphin
yeah.
writer will write some betting stuff. We have a betting department now, and we write betting stuff to write betting stuff.
You either do it right or don't do it at all,
Right.
right? Doing it with one toe in is not the approach at all. Who created your mock draft simulator? Because I think I know who it is. It's the guy who created relative athletic score, right?
I don't know his
Yeah,
background when
yeah.
it comes to
It's
that.
it, Kent Lee Platty. I had him
Yes,
on as a
yes,
guest.
yes.
Once
That is
upon,
his name. I didn't know he had created that as well.
yeah,
That obviously came before me. But Ken,
yeah.
I believe his name is. I mean, you said his name, but he also has his
Math
nickname.
is Math Bomb. He created
Math Bomb.
the
Yes.
relative athletic score where each draft prospect is rated based on everybody who's ever tested. This is the guy who came out and said Anthony Richardson is the most athletic quarterback
Yeah.
in the history of football, right? So
Yes.
I remember I
Yes.
remember
Math
first
Bomb.
playing. Yeah, I remember first playing with the simulator when he was on as a guest, and he told me he created it. One more question for you. Where do you think content goes in 5 years? Right? Is there going to be an evolution of content? Because right now it feels like we're drinking water out of a fire hydrant, right? Just everywhere you go, you're getting so much of it, and everyone's focusing on quantity and maybe less of quality. Do you think that that's inevitable? This is the new thing, and until the next new thing happens, it's going to be overload, and everybody's going to try to create an angle in the sports betting space.
I mean, with sports betting, you have to do it the right way. You have to have the most compelling stats and storylines. You can't just have random stuff out there. I do think you're going to see a massive consolidation with sports betting, media companies, and books. You see ESPN doing the deal with Penn Gaming, PointsBet with NBC. You just saw that Fanatics just bought PointsBet because PointsBet was with them. I think you're going to see.
FanDuel created its own channel, Pinnacle with the Hammer Betting Network. Is it going to be sports books are married to the sports betting content providers?
They are, and CBS was with Caesars for a while, and ESPN was with Caesars for a while, and they still are until they transition to Penn. You're not going to get rid of the MGMs and Caesars of the world, but Caesars did pivot recently from betting content uh, to more entertainment focused stuff. They still have Caesars Sportsbook, but they don't have the content wing that DraftKings now does, or that Penn's going to have with ESPN. So I think you are going to see a bigger focus on consolidation in the sports betting industry.
All right, David, I appreciate your time. I really
Absolutely.
enjoyed myself. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Hey, that's it for me. Another edition of 90 Degrees is in the books. I want to thank my guest, David Bearman, Chief Content Officer at the Pro Football Network, the sponsors of this podcast, Pinnacle and BetStamp, and my producer, Jason Cooper. Thanks for listening. Do me a favor before you go, like the content, subscribe, share, and comment. We'll be back next week with another guest on the 90 Degrees podcast where we give an inside look into the sports betting industry. That's it for me. Hope you enjoyed. Until next time.